They thought I'd roll over when they cut a road straight through my land, as if my property rights meant nothing. But when I stood my ground, the HOA didn't just push back. They sued me, trying to bury me under legal fees and humiliation. What they never expected was that their greed had lit a fire they couldn't control. Because this fight wasn't about money anymore, it was about power, pride, and survival. And in the end, one question remained. Who really owned this neighborhood, the HOA or me? When I first bought the property, I wasn't looking for trouble. I wanted peace, space, and a place that actually felt like home. My land sat on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, a wide stretch of trees, a creek running behind it, and enough distance from the next house that I could finally breathe. For a while, life was simple. I worked during the week, spent weekends tending to the yard, and felt like I'd finally escaped the noise of the city. The neighbors waved politely, and the community seemed calm, almost too calm. There was a strange rhythm to it all. Manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, rules printed in neat little booklets that everyone pretended to follow without question. The HOA liked things uniform, predictable, and under control. But I wasn't the kind of person to fuss over the height of my grass or the shade of paint on my shutters. I minded my business, and I expected others to mind theirs. For a while, it seemed to work. At least that's what I thought. What I didn't realize was that the HOA had plans far bigger than keeping lawns trimmed. They were already looking at maps, drawing lines, and deciding what land belonged to them, even if it wasn't theirs to take. And my property, the place I'd poured my savings into, was right in their sights. At first, the conflict felt like a misunderstanding. I told myself that when I received the first letter from the HOA, it had to be a mistake. The envelope looked so official, stamped with their logo, typed in that cold, detached language. They claimed my driveway was non-compliant with neighborhood standards because of its gravel finish. Never mind that my home wasn't even part of the neatly paved cul-de-sacs they managed. My property sat on the edge of the community, technically under their jurisdiction on paper, but always treated as separate. I ignored it, figuring it would fade. It didn't fade. A second letter came 2 weeks later. This time they fined me, not for the gravel driveway, but for obstruction of community property. The obstruction, according to them, was a section of my fence that ran along the back of the creek. I had built that fence years earlier on my land to keep my dog from wandering too far. They claimed the creek was community access. I knew the deed lines by heart. It wasn't. The creek was mine. That's when the uneasy politeness of the neighborhood started to crack. Suddenly, I noticed cars slowing down in front of my house. Strangers with clipboards stood on the edge of my yard, measuring, jotting notes, and leaving without a word. I confronted one once, but he flashed his HOA badge and told me I'd be hearing from the board. I realized then, they weren't trying to enforce rules. They were building a case. The third letter came with a demand. The HOA announced their plan to build a new community access road that would cut directly through the southern edge of my land. They wrote it so casually, like it was a matter of fact. The board has voted to approve the road project. Construction will begin next quarter. We request your cooperation in removing any obstructions. My obstructions? That was my land, my trees, my soil, my home. I tried calling the HOA president, a man named Harold, who had that kind of forced cheer in his voice that made my blood boil. He told me this was for the greater good of the community, that we all make sacrifices, and that my property line had always been a little unclear. I told him I had the deed, the survey, the proof. He chuckled and said, "Well, I guess we'll just have to sort that out in court." That's when it started to feel less like a dispute and more like a siege. Construction trucks appeared one morning, rumbling down the street like an invading army. They parked at the edge of my property. When I confronted the foreman, he shrugged and told me he was just following orders from the HOA. I blocked their path with my truck, refusing to let them pass. By evening, I had a violation notice taped to my door. Obstruction of HOA-approved construction. Another fine. The neighbors started whispering. Some looked at me with pity, others with annoyance, as if I was the problem. I'd hear doors slam when I walked by, see curtains twitch. It wasn't just the board anymore. The entire community was being turned against me. And that's exactly how the HOA wanted it. Weeks went by like this. Letters stacked higher. The fines ballooned into thousands. The HOA filed a lawsuit claiming I was the one trespassing on my own property. They demanded I pay damages for obstructing development. Couldn't sleep. Every sound outside felt like another truck coming to tear up my land. I'd wake up to find new survey stakes driven into my soil, bright orange flags marking the supposed path of the road. Each stake felt like a knife in my gut. I pulled them out, every last one, and threw them into the creek. The next morning, they were back. The breaking point came at a community meeting. I walked into that sterile, fluorescent-lit room with its rows of folding chairs and neatly printed agenda sheets. Harold stood at the front, smiling like a salesman. The moment I sat down, I felt the eyes on me. He started the meeting with a vote on the road improvement project. Every hand shot up in favor except mine. Harold grinned and said, "Motion passed unanimously." The room chuckled at my protest. It was theater and I was the villain in their play. I stood up and told them they had no right, that my property was mine and no piece of paper from their HOA binder could change that. Harold's smile slipped just for a moment, but then he leaned into the microphone and said, "Sir, if you continue to disrupt this meeting, we will have you removed." Removed from a meeting about a road on my own land. That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by stacks of letters, fines, and legal notices. My savings were draining into attorney consultations. Every call with the HOA ended with smug threats about inevitable outcomes. They wanted me exhausted, broke, humiliated. And for a moment, I almost gave in. Almost. But then I remembered something Harold had said on the phone. "We all make sacrifices." That line echoed in my head, over and over, until it twisted into something else. What if I wasn't the one making the sacrifice? What if they were? I started digging through property records, tax filings, and the HOA's own charter. The deeper I went, the more cracks I found. Their bylaws weren't just sloppy. They were vulnerable. They had overstepped their own authority so many times it was almost laughable. Mismanaged funds. Votes held without proper notice. Illegal assessments. All written down, black and white, waiting for someone stubborn enough to use it. And I wasn't just stubborn, I was furious. So when the HOA officially filed their lawsuit against me, claiming ownership of a road that didn't exist yet, I did something they never expected. I countersued, not just to stop their road, not just to protect my land, but to expose every corrupt thread holding their little kingdom together. The day of the trial felt less like justice and more like stepping into an ambush. The courthouse was sterile, echoing, and cold. Yet the weight of the moment pressed down on me like a storm I'd been marching toward for months. The HOA board members arrived in suits, smug and polished, as if they were walking into a coronation instead of a legal proceeding. At the center was Harold, the president, his grin tight and rehearsed. He shook hands with their attorney, loud enough for me to hear him say, "This won't take long." For weeks leading up to this, they had buried me in motions and filings, paperwork designed to drown me before I ever got to speak. Their strategy was intimidation by bureaucracy, and for a time it almost worked. But my countersuit had forced this confrontation, and now every lie, every abuse of power, every fabricated fine was about to be dragged into the light. We presented the financial records I had uncovered, evidence showing that Harold and the board had diverted thousands of dollars in road improvement fees into a private account. It wasn't just mismanagement. It was embezzlement. For years, they had been lining their pockets under the guise of community projects, and the road through my property was just their latest scheme. Harold's face went pale, his smirk crumbling into something between fury and panic. His attorney tried to object, to wave it away as irrelevant, but the judge leaned forward, her expression sharp, and allowed it in. Suddenly, the entire board looked less like community leaders and more like criminals caught red-handed. The tension in the room spiked. The HOA attorney scrambled, demanding recesses, trying to stall, but the tide had turned. My lawyer pressed harder, laying out every violation, every abuse of power, every instance where the board had acted outside the authority of its own bylaws. What started as their lawsuit against me had transformed into a full-scale indictment of their entire regime. By the time I took the stand, the atmosphere was electric. I told my story plainly, not as a fighter but as a neighbor. How I had wanted peace, how I had respected the community, how all I ever asked was to be left alone on land that was rightfully mine. I described the endless fines, the threats, the trucks at my property line, the humiliation of being treated like a trespasser in my own home. My voice cracked once, not with weakness but with the raw frustration of months of siege. And as I spoke, I saw something shift in the jury's eyes. They weren't just listening to a legal argument anymore. They were feeling the weight of what the HOA had done. The defense tried to recover. Harold even took the stand, puffing up his chest and insisting everything was for the good of the community. But every time he spoke, it only made him look smaller. When asked about the missing funds, he stumbled. When asked about the illegal fines, he grew defensive. And when pressed about why they tried to seize my land, he snapped. His voice rising, his mask slipping, the arrogance boiling over. "You think you're special?" He spat at me across the courtroom. "Everyone sacrifices for the HOA. Everyone plays by the rules. You think you're above it all, but you're not. You're nothing without us." The room fell silent. Even his own board members looked away. That was the breaking point. His words didn't just condemn him. They revealed the truth. The HOA wasn't about community. It was about control. And in that instant, the jury saw it for themselves. Closing arguments felt almost anticlimactic. Their attorney mumbled about order and rules, but the energy was gone. My lawyer stood with quiet confidence, reminding the jury that this wasn't just about me. It was about every homeowner who had been bullied, fined, and threatened by people drunk on power. When the jury filed out, my hands trembled. Minutes stretched into an eternity. And then they returned. The verdict was clear, decisive, and devastating for the HOA. Not only did the court rule that the land was mine, but the countersuit succeeded. The HOA was found guilty of mismanagement, illegal fines, and misuse of funds. Damages were awarded. Their authority was stripped. And Harold, once the self-proclaimed king of the neighborhood, was left standing red-faced and defeated, the weight of his own arrogance crushing him in front of everyone he once ruled. The board members avoided his gaze as the gavel struck. Some slipped out quietly, others sat frozen, too stunned to move. Neighbors in the gallery exchanged looks of shock, whispers spreading like wildfire. For the first time in months, I felt the air leave my lungs in something close to relief. But the fight wasn't over, not yet. Because while the courtroom had delivered justice, the fallout in the neighborhood was just beginning. The HOA wasn't simply dismantled in a single stroke. There would be chaos, anger, and fractures among the very people who had once turned their backs on me. And I knew that stepping back into that community after everything that happened would be a battle of its own. Still, as I walked out of that courtroom, past Harold's defeated glare, past the neighbors' hushed voices, I felt something stronger than anger. Vindication. Power. For once, I wasn't the one under siege. They were. And the question that lingered wasn't whether I had won. It was what I would do now that the HOA's crown had been shattered and handed to me. When the gavel fell, it didn't just echo in the courtroom. It reverberated through the entire neighborhood, like a thunderclap splitting the sky. For months, the HOA had walked tall, dictating every inch of our lives with fines, threats, and rules carved in stone. But now, the foundation they had built that false authority on had cracked wide open. And for the first time, everyone could see what lay beneath. The verdict spread through the community like wildfire. Some heard about it in the courthouse itself, whispering as they shuffled out of the benches. Others caught the news from neighbors or from the bold headlines in the local paper. HOA president found guilty of mismanagement, embezzled funds exposed. The story traveled faster than the board could contain it, faster than Harold could spin it. And suddenly, the fear that had hung over so many homeowners began to lift.